Hi everyone, welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism. I think today we're on class number 12, continuing with the Way to Buddhahood, Changfod's Tao, by the great modern Chinese Buddhist master Venerable Inshun. Today we are just continuing on as we do every week, and we've got up to the third part of the text where we are really starting to get into the body of the material. So for those of you that have had the patience to stay with us so far, good work, because now we're actually getting more into sort of the content. I think a lot of the stuff beforehand is, for maybe many people, sort of like prep work or foundational work and sort of like putting things in order and organizing everything. But today we're actually starting to get into some of the content proper. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm just going to check and make sure everything's working properly here on the live stream. It is. With no further ado, let's jump on into the text itself. So, as we can see here, we're up to section 3, the Dharma common to the 5 vehicles. And if you recall from last week, just a little reminder what those 5 vehicles are. We've got this concept that Venerable Inshun here is breaking up all of these teachings. Well, actually, this whole idea of the 5 vehicles isn't his creation. It's found in a couple of earlier texts as well, but he's definitely like using it really clearly for the structure. Anyway, so the 5 vehicles are basically dependent on 5 particular goals for our practice. So depending on what our goal or our motivation is for our practice, that then decides which vehicle we're in, right? So if you recall, if the goal is in this idea of, well, we just want to be happy in this life, or we want to be happy in future lives, either as a human or maybe in the divine world, these are the first 2 vehicles. So they come under the broad category of happiness in the present life or happiness in future lives. And we've got either the human vehicle or we've got the divine vehicle, right? These are the first 2. And then after that, we go on into these vehicles for liberation. So this idea that just happiness in this life or future lives isn't enough. These are still impermanent, right? And still ultimately dissatisfactory. If we're seeking liberation from cyclic existence, then we get into the 3rd vehicle, that which leads to the goal of becoming an arahant, a liberated sage, or a pratyeka Buddha, a solitary Buddha, or last but not least, this idea of becoming a fully awakened Buddha for the benefit of oneself and others. So these are the 5 vehicles depending on one's motivation and one's goal for one's practice. And another important thing, which we see in the title here, right? So the Dharma common to the 5 vehicles. It means that because each of the higher vehicles builds on the foundation of those before, so we need this like common platform which is shared by all these vehicles. And this is the section here. Really, you could say it's the Dharma common to the 5 vehicles, or we can say it's also basically the first 2 vehicles, right? If you can't secure happiness in this life or a future life as just a regular human being, and you want to talk about becoming a bodhisattva and attaining full awakening, it's not going to happen. Okay, so what then is that content? Let's look here first of all at verse number 29. 正信归一者，应修于正见，即修于正命，胜进不为难。One who has gone for refuge through right faith should cultivate right views and cultivate right livelihood. Then superior progress will not be difficult. Okay, so really 2 main points here that are being mentioned. This idea of the importance of right view and the importance of right livelihood, and like as a foundation for like all the vehicles, irrespective of what one wants to achieve through one's practice of the Dharma. These 2 are critical for both right view and right livelihood. And it's just, the first line is just referring to basically the practitioner, right? One's gone for refuge through right faith, and we've talked earlier, a few weeks ago now, that basically this act of saying, I go to the Buddha for refuge, I go to the Dharma for refuge, I go to the Sangha for refuge, is the sort of foundational act that makes one a Buddhist. If anyone's looking for a sort of a definition, what makes one a Buddhist or not a Buddhist, 9 times out of 10, I think the vast majority of Buddhist traditions will say that going for refuge is what makes one a Buddhist. So that's just talking about the person. It's pretty basic. And then if we've got right view and right livelihood, then superior progress, 胜进, will not be difficult. So sort of like the key foundational element, and in a sense, like, I mean, right view and having this right understanding of how the world is and how the world works and what one needs to do to progress in the spiritual journey is just a view. I mean, the term, let's just talk maybe a little bit first about this phrase, right view. So 正见 in Chinese, in Sanskrit, it's samyak drishti, and it's, I mean, it's very literal, right view. In a sense, though, it's kind of like the way in which we understand things, and I like to also refer to this idea as like a worldview. How do we understand the world? And this is really quite important. The whole idea of worldviews to me is, it's a really important part, not just us as individuals, but like whole cultures and civilizations, right? Particularly religious worldviews. How does the world work? And therefore, how should we act within the world? And that way you can kind of look at it as a belief system. And I think we've talked earlier a few weeks ago as well about the distinctions between, how there's this emphasis in most Western presentations of Buddhism. It's all about wisdom, it's not about belief. But actually, for the vast majority of us when we're practicing, until we have seen, for example, until you've seen for yourself past lives, until you've seen all these things for yourself, we are kind of taking it as a statement of faith, right? We believe in these things. We might have various forms of evidence. All faith or belief doesn't have to be blind faith. We can have a lot of evidence for these types of things. And that's what we're meaning here when we talk about a worldview, then the way in which we understand the world, which influences then the way we act. So you've got two parts. One is right view and the other part is right livelihood. Now, if you just scroll down, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit and show you like some of the headings. This heading, actually for this section, doesn't have a heading in the English version. It shows you a Roman. It just basically says, entering the path of cultivation and training. Or entering the gate. And then the next section just talks about right livelihood and then right views. But under the section of right livelihood, there's actually like there's no separate like verse. Now, I think I mentioned right at the start, the book itself, The Way to Buddhahood, isn't just these verses. It has like the verse, and then it has like an explanation and an unpacking, which is kind of what I'm doing now, except I'm using the verses and giving my own unpacking. The main reason is simply that I feel if we're doing this in English, a lot of the examples that are given in the original Chinese book are really appropriate for sort of mid-ish 20th century China, but they don't work so well in like, early 21st century Western civilization. The examples just are not the best examples. That's why I'm doing it this way. I'm using the basic verses, sticking core to the text, giving my own explanation. Anyway, so it's got this idea of right livelihood here, right? Cultivate right livelihood, but it doesn't actually have much more detail about it at this point. And the basic gloss is simply to say that one's livelihood, which is one's, means of making a living. It's how we, it's how we make a living, what our jobs are, what our professions are, what our vocations are, basically shouldn't violate your core 5 precepts. So forms of livelihood that involve taking life. So butchering, for example, is inappropriate. Not to mention being an executioner or some paid assassin. Okay, it's a bit of an extreme example. Other things that go against these basic principles. It talks about opening a brothel, for example, which would go against the principle of refraining from sexual misconduct, etc., etc. So it just kind of gives a really brief gloss on those. And the reason being that, when we talk about the 5 precepts and we talk about, breaking those precepts, we usually kind of phrase it like it's a one-off case. Like, a person steals someone's money. Well, okay, that's obviously theft. That's obviously like a really negative karma that's motivated by, greed or some kind of malice or something like that. It's a bad thing. In a one-off case. So imagine if somebody's like livelihood, their job is to do this sort of thing all day, every day, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday or whatever. That's gonna like build up a massive amount of bad karma. And so livelihood sometimes kind of gets a little bit overlooked, I think, in the West. People want to immediately talk about meditation, mindfulness, and they want to talk about right view and philosophy. But we also need to think, well, what am I just doing in my day-to-day life? Really important. It's a really important foundation. So in the text, it kind of mentions this, but it just gives a really quick gloss. And then the idea of right view, it then goes into a lot of detail. So we're going to need to go back to the text here now, and we're going to look through and see what it talks about of right views. So section on right views is in multiple sections, and I'm going to skim through really quickly and just give you the headings before we get into each of these one by one. So the existence of wholesome and unwholesome states, the existence of karma, or action, and retribution for that karma, the existence of past and future lives, the existence of so-called ordinary people versus holy people or awakened, wise people, and the existence of the 5 destinies, so which kind of couples in not just with past lives, but this idea that living beings exist in many different forms, and it just goes through these, and then it goes through the higher destinies and the lower destinies. And then we get into the origins of suffering and happiness, which is again in the cause and effect relationship, and the importance of wholesome action. Then it gets into this next section on right practice. So there's quite a chunk of information here, and the key thing that the text wants to say is simply having a right view is really critical to our practice. Now, I also just want to sort of emphasize this as well. And I want to talk about this in two points. One is, someone might say, well, really, how important is that? Isn't the most important thing that we're practicing or we're doing those certain things and not just this idea of belief or faith? Okay, so this is a really good question. Now, one thing that people will often say, it's not so much about what you believe, it's what you do. Okay, well, that sounds quite reasonable. But I want to point out, and this is a really important point, well, some people make this distinction as sort of like theory. One's the theory and one's the practice. And surely it's the practice that is really what's critical. Yes and no, but I want to point out this key point. When we talk about practice, so what do we mean in practice? If we're talking about our actions, in Buddha's term, our actions are 3 types: body, speech, and mind. And so it's not just a matter of saying the practice is what we do. And normally when we say that in English, like what we do, we mean what we do with our physical bodies, right? How we do things in this 3-dimensional flesh space, shall we say. But it's not just that for Buddhism. It's also what you think, including what you believe, is also a doing. And that has a force, it has a power. Now, I think there's a few reasons why this aspect gets de-emphasized in Western portrayals of Buddhism. One, I think, is that simply the way in which Buddhism itself has been portrayed. Like I said earlier, you don't need belief. You can, that's not the most important thing. Buddhism doesn't deal with belief and this kind of thing. Another idea is the way that Buddhism is being portrayed as this very inclusivist religion. And therefore you can be a practicing Christian or practicing any other religion and also practice Buddhism, as though Buddhism wouldn't impinge upon your other beliefs. Like, you can believe in this one other system and do this other, and do the same Buddhist practice. Well, I'm sorry, most Buddhism doesn't get really portrayed in that way. Now, it's not to say you can't do that, but there is a bit of a question about whether or not then you're doing Buddhist practice. Might not really be Buddhist practice. It might be some other practice, and it still might be beneficial for you. It doesn't have to be Buddhist to be good for you. But kind of that mix and match way of religions is often the way in which Buddhism is presented. And another one, I think, is a non-religious thing, and it's kind of the scientific base, whereby, in science you can do the idea of, if you do a physical experiment, you do a physics experiment, you do a chemistry experiment or something, it doesn't matter what you believe. Right? That's the whole idea. It's not about your beliefs. You just go through and you're measuring speeds and weights and velocities and chemical reactions and temperatures and all these physical parameters. And whether or not you believe in gravity still works. Okay, now this principle, which is kind of like a fundamental kind of principle for the physical sciences, works for the physical sciences because and there's this basic belief in the physical sciences that your thoughts completely have no effect upon the physical world. But we're not talking about a physical experiment here. We're talking about a psychological experiment. I mean, we're talking about happiness and suffering. We're talking about dissatisfaction and the end of dissatisfaction. These are all subjective inner states. And so if our laboratory is the mind, with all these things that are going on in the mind, and we're doing experiments with the mind and how the mind works, if I can use the word experiment and push this kind of like comparison with physical sciences, what you believe is not external to the experiment. It's part of the experiment. It's part of your lab. So what you believe then is a part of that. So again, I think we've had this attitude of like, it doesn't really matter what you believe, it's what you do. Works fine for external things, for the physical world. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about the inner world, the inner subjective world, and then what you believe is very much a part of it. If you go into a meditation practice believing very strongly, this practice will be good for me, versus if you go into that same meditative practice and you think, this is useless, it's a waste of time, it's complete hokey, it's fraud, you're going to get quite a different result. Belief is one of the parameters of the experiment, shall we say. Okay, that's my little rant. My little rant for the day. Okay, I like this little rant. I often go on this little rant, but I think it needs to be said, okay? So, where are we? We're back here. So you've got right at the start here all these ideas about right views and the importance of right views. That's why this is put right at the beginning. And this is classically acknowledged in the start of Buddhist teachings themselves. Look at the Eightfold Path. Even though the Eightfold Path, strictly speaking, is the path that leads to liberation, that's really in the vehicle of the Arahants and the Pratchika Buddhas. Here we're not. We're still just on this foundation for humans and divine beings and happiness in this and future lives. Right view still comes at the front. Okay, that's a lot of blah from me. I need to get into this material. Verse number 30. 所说增减者，人生之正观. The aforementioned right views are the correct perspective on life, or you could say on human life. So, this term here, 正见, right view, this character here in Chinese isn't just right, it's kind of like upright. It's almost a bit like righteous in a kind of a good sense, not a kind of a hypocritical sense. It's the same character that's used over here for the correct perspective. This character actually has this really old sense of like if you're doing like a drawing and you've got like a measure, it makes, you know, your horizontal line and your vertical line. So it makes sure things are upright and straight and proper. So that's the sense of zheng here. And guan, you can even see here in this character jian, which means to see. Can you see this little character here is actually found on the right hand side of this character here, guan. And guan is sort of like the way in which you see things, the way in which you contemplate. It's also like a perspective or a point of view. So that's why I've been saying earlier, this idea of right view, we can also look at it as like a world view. You need the right way of understanding things, right? Okay, now we've got a bunch of these. We're not going to be able to get through all of them today, but let's maybe at least get through one more. The first of these is, in Chinese, 有善有恶. There is wholesome, there is unwholesome. The existence of wholesome and unwholesome. What does that mean? Verse 31. 心静或不静，利他或损他，善行不善行，佛子因地察. Whether the mind is pure or impure, whether deeds are beneficial to others or harmful to others, whether actions are wholesome or unwholesome, Buddhists, or literally disciples of the Buddha, Buddhists should attentively observe. So when we're talking about this idea of wholesome and unwholesome, the key thing here is simply to say that this idea of like, let's just morality, that there is wholesome behavior and there's unwholesome behavior. It's a thing. I'm not going to say it's a thing in absolute ultimate reality, because I don't want to push this idea of like capital absolute capital R reality, absolute truth with a capital T, because when we get later into more heavy Buddhist thought, that's a bit problematic. But in terms of just when we talk about things in regular discourse, yeah, there are actions which are wholesome and there are actions which are unwholesome. We don't take this approach that sort of like, oh, all morality is purely a social construct and therefore there's really no such thing. It's just like, well, in this society they think it's good, they think it's bad. In a different society they have different views on what's good and bad, therefore none of it's really real. You can just sort of like create your own rules. Sorry, we're not going to do that. Sure, different societies do have different ideas about what is wholesome and unwholesome, but that doesn't mean that it's accurate and correct. Some societies used to think that sacrificing small children to the gods was a good thing and it would bring, I don't know, rains or a good crop or something. And I'm just going to go, no. Sacrificing children and sacrificing any animals is not a good thing, like ever. It just isn't. So what's then the Buddhist basis for what constitutes something being wholesome or unwholesome? The first line is the key thing. So it's one's mental state. The driving factor is the mental state. The mind being pure or impure. We can also take in consideration whether deeds are beneficial or harmful to others. And then these are the sort of the baselines for saying whether an action is wholesome or unwholesome. Now, one of my teachers back in the seminary, he's very smart. He'd always get you thinking about things. Venerable Hui Xiang. And we'd say, like, is cutting someone open with a knife like wholesome or unwholesome, like good or bad? And we'd be like, oh, that's horrible. You know, we'd immediately think of somebody like stabbed to death or something. Think like, that's unwholesome. And he goes, well, what if they're a surgeon? I'm like, oh yeah. What if they are a surgeon? Well, they're doing something, you know, good and wholesome to them. So note here, the definition doesn't start with like the physical action. It starts with the first two lines are really like motivational things. So the horrible knife murderer does not have a pure state of mind, right? They're trying to they've got anger or aggression, and they're also trying to hurt the other rather than be beneficial to them, right? So that's kind of the key driving force then. And then this leads to whether or not an action is considered to be wholesome or unwholesome. Now, this is a really quick gloss on this line, and of course, I think when you read this, the next thing you want to say, well, okay, sure, but what constitutes pure or impure? What constitutes beneficial or harmful? All we're doing is saying these two fairly abstract concepts of wholesome and unwholesome, but we're just defining them in ways which are also not very clear. So the verses don't give a lot of that detail, but from Buddhist teachings themselves, they do go into a huge amount of detail on this type of thing. Buddhist analysis of different states of mind is extensive, to say the least. So let's just talk about a couple of the wholesome states and the unwholesome states. Usually they actually give the unwholesome ones first. So craving, which includes like craving, desire, attachment, all these types of things, is a big driving force, and that's an unwholesome one. Second unwholesome one is usually there's sort of like hatred or anger, but I like to use the term aversion, because even before, like, you know, hatred or anger to me is like quite a strong or powerful emotion. Aversion's like a lower level of that, and even at the level of like aversion to something, it's still already like a negative state of mind, an unwholesome, impure state of mind, and it just builds up and becomes stronger. And of course, don't forget ignorance. Ignorance is also another big one, and that's considered to be impure. The flip side, so ignorance of what? Well, it includes ignorance of like these basic principles of right view, understanding that pure actions lead to happiness and pure actions lead to suffering, for example. If we don't know that, and when you think that sacrificing babies to the gods is going to bring you a happy result, that's ignorance, right? That's a driving force. Now then, the pure states are pretty much like the reverse of those. So instead of like desire or attachment, it's relinquishment, the ability to like let go of things and not be attached. The opposite of aversion, hatred, kindness, compassion. And the opposite of ignorance, of course, is knowledge and understanding. Now, these are the three big ones in sort of three pairs, right? Craving or desire, aversion, ignorance, and the flip side, relinquishment, love, kindness, and understanding. Unwholesome states, wholesome states, or impure states and pure states of mind. Now, it's important to add in that principle there of ignorance when we want to talk about this idea of benefiting others or being harmful to others, and we want to talk about motivation. Because what people might say is like, oh, well, what if you do something and you think it's, somebody does something with a good intention, but it's a bad action. And look, you Buddhists, you say it's all about intention, so surely that would be a wholesome action. So let's say somebody thinks, I don't know, to use a silly example, sacrificing babies to the gods is going to bring you a good harvest. And they've got a good intention, right? Because they want a good harvest and they want to benefit everyone. So that's a good intention. So don't you Buddhists think then that would be a wholesome action? Well, in a way, but the fact is they've got a huge amount of ignorance in there. They've kind of got like a good intention for everyone, except for the person they're sacrificing, to whom they have some very nasty intention. No, you could say, but what if they think that they're reborn with the gods or they go to some happy place? Okay, even then, the fact is you've got this mass amount of ignorance involved. And so ignorance, again, is a factor with an intention. So this is a key thing. Intention includes a correct understanding or ignorance of a situation. You can't leave that out. This idea of, but they had a good intention, but they were ignorant. So it's still very problematic. You got to keep that in mind. Okay, so hopefully that's kind of dealt with the first two ideas. So this idea of pure states of mind, impure states of mind. We've talked about like craving, aversion, ignorance. This can be unpacked in even more detail later on. There's also jealousy, pride. There's all sorts of variations of these states of mind as well. And of course, you've got the reverse as well. The opposite of pride actually isn't humbleness. It's actually a lack of like self-view. All forms of pride and conceit are actually based on like comparing ourselves to others and thinking that you're better than others as an impure state of mind. The pure state of mind isn't actually thinking that others are better than you. It's actually just not having that comparison, not having that sense of self and other, and making that comparison in the first place. And then jealousy is countered by having like what's called sympathetic joy, where you can be happy for the successes of others rather than being jealous of their successes. And it continues on. A lot more greater analysis of mental states. And this intention of wanting to benefit others or wanting to harm others, then these become the criteria for whether an action is wholesome or unwholesome in line number 3. And the last point there, fortsättning ditar, as Buddhist practitioners, we need to pay attention to that, right? So we've got this term here, ditar. Ta means to like investigate, look into, inspect, examine, and di means like truthfully, really carefully and in detail, accurately observe that and contemplate that. And so this last line, I like it a lot. It indicates that a real important part of our practice as Buddhist practitioners is to observe our own mental states, our own intentions, and our own actions, to reflect upon them. We traditionally actually taught before we act, reflect on what our state of mind is and what we're doing while we're acting. And after we've acted, we can also reflect back retrospectively at what we did and what the results of those were. Now this before, during, and after reflection is actually seen in one of the Buddhist teachings to his son, Rahula. And I think it's good practice in general. So this is the first basic one. Our time's almost up for today. Next week, we'll be continuing on with this basic principle of karma and retribution of karma. Okay, another big question here, big issue, hot issue. Another one that I think its presentation in the West, we need to really examine that and be careful about how we understand it. And some of these other principles. So that's what we've got lined up for the next few weeks. A lot of basic, fundamental Buddhist right view. And I just want to say, last of all, do not think of Buddhist right view and right understanding. The Buddhist world view don't think of it as like theory and practice and it's just theory. Part of the practice itself is having the right theory. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Don't just think of it as like right view is theory versus practice, what we actually do, and therefore think, well, theory just comes secondary to practice, it's just theory. Part of the practice itself is having the right theory. Cultivating and developing right view is one of the things we have to do. It's not simply the sort of belief that has no effect upon our actual practice and thus our actual lives itself. I mean, you can just look at this. Look at people's world views. See how they lead people to different places. It's quite stunning. It's quite startling. Some people have these worldviews that take them to some really bad places, and some people have these worldviews that take them and the people around them to really wonderful places and happiness. I hope we can be in the second category. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm 2 minutes over time, so time to call it quits for today. And we've all got things to do. So if you've got any questions or comments, leave them in the little comment box below and I'll get back to you. Okay, have a good weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.